Last week, I preached at a historic Universalist church in Pittsfield, Maine. I had planned to tell them about John Murray and Thomas Potter, Murray Grove, and how Universalism came to this continent years before the colonies declared their independence from England. I expect I might have bored them silly. But on Friday night, some person or persons tore the congregation's rainbow flag off the building. They did so in a way that ripped the metal brackets right out of the wood trim that is a couple hundred years old. Now, Pittsfield, Maine is in a beautiful patch of rural countryside between Bangor and Waterville, Maine. If Maine has a Bible Belt, Pittsfield's probably the buckle. That rainbow flag is the only publicly displayed rainbow flag for probably 30 miles in any direction. When a neighbor found the crumpled flag in the local park with its singed edges where the vandals had tried to set it afire, well, it was a significant blow. It hurt the small but mighty congregation of Unitarian Universalists, and it hit the local LGBTQ people who looked to the church's flag as a public reminder that they are not so alone in their conservative rural community. So whatever erudite words I had planned to say about Potter and Murray got set aside to deal with this assault on the church and its community. I sat in my hotel room that Saturday night, staring at my computer screen, wishing for words. How do I address the spiritual violence that happens when someone vandalizes a church? Now, I know this congregation has experienced this very thing. What do I do as a minister to speak to that pain, to offer words of hope and encouragement? How do I do that, particularly when that rainbow flag on Friday afternoon had done just what it was intended to do? It made me smile and feel not so alone as I drove through town. Universalism is a very real challenge in times like these. Universal salvation is the foundation of our first principle, that everyone has inherent worth and dignity and is worthy of God's grace, forgiveness, and love. It is at once the simplest and most difficult principle to live into being. How do we find the inherent worth and dignity of people who attack a rainbow flag mounted to a church? Where is the holy in them? Theologically, there is still discussion about this notion. There are some who say that everyone is forgiven immediately after their life here on earth ends, and they are granted entrance into God's eternal grace. There are some who say that a person must be restored to grace before entering heaven, resulting in a purgatory-like time of penance before salvation is awarded. Now, Universalist theology is itself rooted in the realization that all people are flawed and all are in need of God's grace. Unitarian theology is based on the understanding that humans are worthy enough that they do not need God's grace. Thomas Starr King once famously has been misquoted as saying that Universalists believed that God was too good to damn them, and Unitarians believed that they were too good to be damned. As for me, I'm with those who knows what it means to need salvation. I know that I make mistakes. I make mistakes big and small, creative, spectacular, embarrassing, and mundane mistakes. I act badly when I am hurt or scared. I have been known to think uncharitable thoughts about some particularly challenging people. Don't even get me started on politics. And that brings us to where we are today. How do we find the good in someone who will vandalize a church? How do we find the holy in someone who targets the marginalized among us for abuse and attack? How do we find the holy in someone who will allow people to die for lack of help? And the best I can offer is this: that there is good in all people. Sometimes that goodness and tenderness is buried beneath ages of pain and abuse. Sometimes that goodness is eclipsed by behaviors that seem narcissistic. Sometimes that goodness is not evident to anyone at all, save the holy that put it there. Now, what we are called to do as Unitarian Universalists is to affirm and promote the notion that each person has worth and dignity. To do so is an act of faith, which, after all, is sort of the point. It's an act of love and an act of faith to choose to believe that each person, no matter how mean, has the beauty of creation within them. And the other side of that coin calls us to hold ourselves and our neighbors accountable for our behavior. All people have worth and value. All behaviors do not. And it is an act of love to hold one another accountable for our behavior. Holding one another accountable communicates a couple of things. First, it outlines what is acceptable behavior and what is not. It sets healthy boundaries and holds them firm. We will not permit people to do or say hurtful things. We will speak the truth in love. We will trust one another. And second, it shows that we have faith that the person is worth working to bring back into right relationship. There are no disposable people. Each person has value. Even when their behavior is abhorrent, their humanity must not be compromised by us as we work to bring them back into relationship with the community. My Unitarian Universalist faith calls me to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, and that can be such a challenge in these modern times. How can I see the humanity of people who would hurt others, whether by direct violence or by failure to act, as we are witnessing in Puerto Rico? How can I see God in them? And yet I believe that all people are worthy of God's grace and God's mercy and God's love. I cannot believe in a God that would create a place as terrible as hell and humanity so flawed as to be sent there. God is either capable of forgiveness of all sins, or God is limited in ways that seem to violate the terms of the omnipotence clause. Nobody commits an act of terrorism, foreign or domestic, just for giggles. Violence is the act of people who feel they have been marginalized, ignored, exploited, and oppressed for so long that their hearts and theology have turned to poison and hate. That kind of hate is incubated in fear and isolation and an understanding of the world as a hostile, terrifying place. People resort to violence in order to communicate what they feel their words cannot. And this happens whether their oppression is real or whether it is merely their privilege that is being threatened. answering terrorism, whether from schoolyard bullies, the White House, or on the international stage, answering that terrorism with violence does not solve anything and certainly does not move the conflict toward a resolution. There is an old African proverb that says, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Now, I'm not saying that we should not defend ourselves when we are attacked, nor am I saying that hate-based terrorism is the way to achieve anything. What I am saying is that the attack on that little church and on the LGBTQ people represented by that rainbow flag is a much deeper, older problem, one rooted in fear of the unknown, toxic masculinity, toxic theology, patriarchy, and all the rest. There is a very real fear experienced by people who have enjoyed privilege for a great long while when those who are presently oppressed outnumber their oppressors and move into leadership positions. There's a fear that they will then treat the new minority as they were treated during those long centuries. Wanda Sykes famously said, when she was talking about what people call reverse racism, she says, that's not reverse racism, that's karma. And it is in itself an admission of complicity in a system that marginalizes those who are vulnerable, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and the many glorious shades of queer that present themselves, those who are undocumented immigrants, those who are people of color, who have physical limitations that do not permit them access to all places. That fear indicates that they know there is an equality and that they know it is wrong and they do not want it for themselves. That's a sermon for another day. Let me offer you this, though. People who have food do not loot grocery stores. People who have hope do not riot in the streets. People who are secure in their relationships do not leap first to jealousy and accusation. People who are free to express themselves do not foment rebellion. People who trust the police to keep them safe do not stockpile weapons. People who are secure do not need to bully others in order to feel good about themselves. People, nations, and religions that do not feel, it's important, feel attacked, don't generally attack others. People who feel good about themselves do not vandalize houses of worship. Nations that are sure of their place in the world do not build walls to keep others out. Walls built to keep others out inevitably are used to keep people in. Lao Tse taught us that if we want peace in the world, we must first cultivate peace among nations. And if we want peace within our nations, we must cultivate peace among our communities. And if we want peace in our communities, we must cultivate peace among our families. And if we want peace in our families, we must cultivate peace among ourselves. And if we want peace in ourselves, we must cultivate peace in our hearts and in our minds and with our words and our actions. We must begin at home in our own hearts if we are to have peace in the world. We must work together, each engaged in their own work, as we must work together to hold our leaders accountable and implement policies that support the vulnerable instead of deport them or arrest them or kill them. We who have privilege must use that privilege to support others, to center the voices of the oppressed and the marginalized in any discussion of justice work, or indeed any discussion. I believe that humanity's default setting points towards progress. I believe that humanity's default setting points toward goodness. I believe that wounded and cornered animals bite, and that hurt people hurt people. Sir Isaac Newton taught us that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. I believe that happens in human relations as well as in the physics lab and beneath the apple tree. When a group feels attacked, it defends itself against that attack. In football, it is the second guy who gets the foul. One player commits a foul, and the victim of the foul hits back. He gets the flag. Off the field of football, it's not actually that different. One party agitates and agitates until the object of that agitation blows up and hits back. And when the offending party is blindsided by that response, it speaks to a culture of privilege and entitlement. It had never occurred to the offending party that what they were doing was offensive. This scenario plays out as clearly on the world's geopolitical stage as it does on a school playground. And the way to stop that cycle is for one person to disrupt the system and call all the parties into relationship with one another. Must that be our job? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But if not us, then whom? And if not in my town, then which town? If not my nation, then which nation? And if not now, when? We are all that we have. There is no perfect time to do this work. The time is now. The job is ours. Practicing universalism is a real challenge, but it can be both a spiritual practice and an act of resistance in our age. When we see the worth of our opponents, we are unable to dehumanize them in our mind's eye, and we treat them with some measure of dignity. Now, I confess that I am not always able to see the inherent worth and dignity of people. For a long while, that inability led me to describe myself as a failed UU. My faith calls me to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all people, and sometimes I just can't. I can't get past the hateful behavior and the words that some will use to see what hurting human souls live within. And when that happens, I take a breath, and then I take another breath, and remind myself that our principles are aspirational, and that I can have faith that a person has worth and dignity. And be grateful I don't have to go find it right now. But I can have faith that it's there. Theodore Parker told us that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And I say that it does not bend on its own. Our role in this world is to help it bend towards justice by adding our weight to the work. So I invite us to work together to disrupt this cycle of violence among nations, among communities, among families, among humans, within our own hearts. May this be our practice and our prayer. Amen.